In tonight's news edition, His Majesty the King discusses with visiting Arab League Secretary General the need to boost joint Arab action and ways to serve Arab issues. Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel is willing to continue U.S. brokered peace talks with the Palestinians, but not at any price. And vote counting is underway in Afghanistan 1 day after a landmark poll to elect a new president to succeed Hamid Karzai. Good evening and welcome to the news at 10. His Majesty the King begins a working visit to Russia on Wednesday, during which he will hold talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin on bilateral ties and ongoing developments in the Middle East, namely the situation in Syria. King Abdullah travels to Russia after concluding 2 working visits to the Vatican, to which he will be heading on Monday, followed by talks in Vienna with the Austrian president. A meeting here in Amman between King Abdullah and Arab League Secretary General Nabil Al-Arabi dealt mainly with the need to boost joint Arab action in light of the situation in the Middle East and the role that the Arab League can play to serve Arab issues. Al-Arabi briefed His Majesty on the Arab League efforts to reconcile Arab views on challenges confronting the region and enhance Arab solidarity. The meeting also reviewed the outcome of the recent Arab summit hosted by Kuwait. The King said it is important to follow up on the summit's resolutions that serve Arab nations and their interests. His Majesty and Al-Arabi also discussed Mideast peace, voicing agreement that the Arab Peace Initiative is a historic opportunity for a peace deal between the Palestinians and Israelis. They also agreed on the need to intensify efforts towards a political solution to the Syria crisis and urged the international community to continue supporting refugees as well as their host communities. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour also met with Al-Arabi in the presence of Foreign Minister Nasser Joudeh. The meeting discussed the agenda of an emergency Arab foreign ministers meeting slated for April 29th at the Arab League's headquarters in Cairo. Al-Arabi said he will continue consultations and coordination with Jordan due to its pivotal role in key Mideast issues and in light of its current membership in the UN Security Council. In a meeting with the leader and members of the parliamentary Al-Nahda bloc, His Majesty affirmed that Jordan's reform process is proceeding according to a well-defined roadmap and is making progress. The first and foremost priority in the reform process, His Majesty said, is the participation of citizens in decision-making. His Majesty said parliamentary blocs must have a vision for the present and future and must be able to work side by side with the executive branch in designing policies and identifying priority developmental projects. He said the nature of challenges facing the nation at present requires a participatory approach by all state institutions as well as civil society in support of reforms, including political, economic, social, as well as administrative. His Majesty discussed with the parliamentarians a number of domestic issues and listened to their views on ways to advance the economy, curb unemployment and poverty, and to develop local communities in the various governorates through decentralization. The 22-member bloc is led by House Representative Amjad Al-Majali. The Prime Minister, present at the meeting, said all proposals and views presented at the meeting will be noted and considered in future policy making. A total of 1,432 Syrian refugees, mostly women, children, and senior people, entered the kingdom through illegal border points during the past 3 days. The Armed Forces Directorate of Moral Guidance said in a statement that border guards stationed along the border between Jordan and Syria received the refugees and provided emergency aid to the injured before transferring them to the Zaatri refugee camp in Mafraq. Speaker of the lower house of Parliament, Atif Tarawne, condemned the assault on security forces during riots at Zaatri camp yesterday, which left 29 gendarmerie and public security personnel hospitalized. One Syrian refugee died today, sustaining gunshot wounds, and another was injured in the riots, which involved some 5,000 refugees. During today's parliamentary session, Minister of Interior Hussein al-Majali presented the circumstances of the incident, saying the riots broke out when three Syrian families carrying with them sundry items attempted to leave the camp illegally. When the security forces tried to stop them, crowds of refugees gathered and threw stones and Molotov bombs at the personnel, who in turn fired tear gas at the rioters. Majali said the refugees also exploded gas cylinders and gunshots were heard in the camp. 10 Syrian individuals were arrested, and security forces are still looking for others who were identified but managed to escape. At a news conference also today, Director of Syrian Refugee Camp Affairs Waddah Hamoud said Jordanian authorities would not resort to the use of firearms in such riots, adding that security personnel acted in line of duty to protect the camp and surrounding areas. He said an investigation is underway to determine the source of the shooting, although he pointed that security forces had searched the camp yesterday but no weapons were found. 24 security personnel were discharged from hospital, while 5 continue to receive medical treatment. Over to the Mideast peace process. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel is willing to continue U.S.-brokered peace talks with the Palestinians, but not at any price. Speaking at the weekly cabinet meeting, Netanyahu cautioned that Israel would respond with steps of its own if the Palestinians pressed ahead with unilateral action. Attempts by the U.S. Secretary of State to put peace talks back on track unraveled in the past week after Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas signed 15 international conventions, mainly through the United Nations, that could give the Palestinians greater leverage against Israel. Abbas decided to sign the conventions after Israel revoked its pledge to free the last group of Palestinian prisoners whose release was agreed under a deal. U.S. envoy Martin Indyk was due to meet sometime today with the chief Israeli and Palestinian negotiators to try to salvage the peace process.
The Palestinians' threats to join the UN will not affect us. The Palestinians have a lot to lose from such a unilateral step. They will achieve a state only through direct negotiations, not through empty announcements and unilateral steps. Those will only push a peace accord further away. Unilateral steps by them will be answered with unilateral steps by us. We are willing to continue negotiations, but we will not do so at any price.
And to the Syria crisis, 2 people were killed when mortar fire hit the ground of Damascus Opera House in the Abbasiyeh area. State television reported the incident but did not give details. Elsewhere, government forces are battling rebels in Damascus's outskirts, including the eastern suburb of Meleha, which saw heavy fighting yesterday. In central Damascus, although under the control of the armed forces, rebels have been able to launch mortar and rocket attacks at heavily secured upscale districts and embassy grounds. On Friday, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said a mortar fell near the Russian embassy in central Damascus, and 2 more mortar rounds landed near a security building. No casualties were reported. Fighting is also raging in the northern province of Aleppo, Dir'a in the south, and Latakia in the west. The Egyptian army were deployed outside Cairo University after a week of protests by students and days after a deadly bomb attack that killed a senior police officer. Army vehicles and soldiers were stationed in the square outside the campus throughout the day as students staged protests inside the university gates. Bombings and shootings targeting the security forces have become commonplace in Egypt since the army deposed President Mohamed Morsi. And a growing insurgency by militants in Egypt is threatening the security of the country ahead of presidential elections in May. And in Iraq, 11 people were killed in various parts of the country in the deadliest of a series of attacks as Iraq prepares for its first parliamentary elections scheduled on the 30th. In the northern city of Tikrit, a suicide bomber rammed a fuel tanker into a police headquarters, killing 3 police officers and wounding 13. And in Maidan, southeast of Baghdad, a bomb in a commercial area killed 2 civilians and wounded 5. Late yesterday, at least 20 Iraqi soldiers were killed, most of them upon entering a house rigged with explosives northwest of the capital. Also yesterday, gunmen wearing military uniforms killed 6 Sunni men south of Baghdad. The gunmen broke into 2 houses in Latifiyah at dawn and took the 6 men, including 2 teenage boys, and shot them dead. There was no immediate claim to the slayings nor to the motive behind the killing. Australian co-coordinators in the search for the missing plane said a Chinese ship has detected a pulse signal for a second time within hours of the same signal being heard yesterday. The search for the missing Malaysia Airlines flight is focused on 2 areas of the Indian Ocean where possible black box signals have been detected. Air Chief Marshal Angus Houston called the discovery in the southern Indian Ocean an important and encouraging lead. Here are the details.
This Chinese patrol vessel is said to have twice detected what could be a flight recorder ping in the search for the missing Malaysia Airlines plane. And Australian vessels also reported picking up a possible acoustic signal. But many, including Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, are urging caution about the reports.
We are hopeful, but by no means certain. This is the most difficult search in human history. We are searching for an aircraft which is at the bottom of a very deep ocean, and it's a very, very wide search area.
Xinhua news agency said a Chinese aircraft had also spotted white objects floating in the southern Indian Ocean. The head of Australia's Joint Agency Coordination Centre said neither the signals nor the sighting could be linked to the missing aircraft at this stage.
That these signals and the objects could not be verified as being related to the missing aircraft at that point in time. That remains the case.
As the search resumed on Sunday, more ships and aircraft were heading to the area where the reported pings were detected. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 vanished on March the 8th with 239 passengers and crew on board.
Confectionery billionaire Petro Poroshenko is one of 2 leading presidential candidates in Ukraine's May 25th election. He says ridding Ukraine of corruption is key for any leadership and warns that failure will anger a reborn nation with high expectations. The election will be a first step by the interim leadership to bring Ukraine back to normalcy after 4 months of turbulence and confrontation with Russia over the annexation of Crimea. Poroshenko, known as the Chocolate King for a chain of shops that earned his fortune, has held a variety of portfolios, including economy minister and foreign minister under both pro-Western and Moscow-backed administrations. He will be up against former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, who has a strong core following. Vote counting is well underway in Afghanistan 1 day after a landmark poll to elect a new president to succeed Hamid Karzai. A high turnout and the Taliban's failure to significantly disrupt the vote has raised questions about the capacity of the insurgents to tip the country back into chaos as foreign troops head back home. More than 300,000 security forces were deployed for the vote and rings of checkpoints and roadblocks around the capital. Officials said deliveries of ballot boxes are running according to schedule. This report has more.
Kabul remains under tight security after Afghanistan's landmark presidential election. Voter turnout was bigger than expected, nearly 60%. This despite threats from Taliban insurgents to derail the vote with violence. There's a palpable sense that just perhaps greater stability is finally within reach.
We're so happy that yesterday's election took place in a peaceful environment. There was good security around the country and everywhere was peaceful.
Saturday's election was Afghanistan's first attempt at a democratic transfer of power since the Taliban lost control of the country. Shukriya Barakzai is a member of parliament. She says the high turnout sent a message to the Taliban, who had called the election a Western sham.
That was a fantastic slap on the face of enemy of Afghanistan, and exactly a big punch on the face of those whom they believe Afghanistan is not ready for democracy.
But now begins a potentially dangerous period for Afghanistan. The winner needs over 50% of votes to avoid a runoff election, which could leave a power vacuum for the Taliban to exploit.
We want the election result to be finalized in the first round. Our people, government, and economy are very weak. If it goes to a second round, it'll be a challenge for our security forces.
Final election results won't come in for another 6 weeks, just when the country desperately needs a leader to stem rising violence, as foreign troops prepare to leave.
It was no ordinary skydiving jump for Norwegian Anders Helstrup after cameras attached to his helmet documented an object shooting past him. During a jump in 2012 from a height of 1,000 meters, Helstrup recorded the unbelievable moment he was almost hit by a falling meteorite. It is thought the object was part of a larger rock which had exploded 20 kilometers above Helstrup. Together with scientists from the Geological Museum in Oslo, the Norwegian Space Center, and the Norwegian Meteorite Network, Helstrup has tried to piece together where the meteorite could have landed. But so far, they have had no luck. Way before the Candy Crush craze, there was Tetris. To celebrate the game's upcoming 30th anniversary and kick off Philly's Tech Week, hundreds of Philadelphia fans had a little fun with a big version of the classic video game. Organizers created a spectacle against the night sky by playing the game on the 29-story Sierra Center skyscraper. The building displayed images of supersized geometric shapes falling on two sides of the mirrored tower as competitors used joysticks to maneuver them into place. It wasn't the first time Tetris has been played on a building, but the 100,000 square foot screen could be a record. Italy staged a superb fight back to beat Britain in the Davis Cup quarterfinals. Britain required one victory to reach their first Davis Cup semifinal since 1981, but Fabio Fognini shocked Andy Murray with a 6-3, 6-3, 6-4 victory. In the same tournament, Andres Seppi eased past James Ward in the decisive fifth match, claiming an unlikely 6-4, 6-3, 6-4 win. Italy will play Switzerland or Kazakhstan in September semifinals, their first appearance at that stage since 1998. Ajax Amsterdam missed the chance to wrap up a fourth successive Dutch league title. They were held 1-1 away at Vitesse Arnhem, while Feyenoord trimmed the gap on them in the standings with a comfortable 2-0 win over RKC Waalwijk. Ajax would have been crowned champions if they had won. However, the title chase remains alive as the points gap between the two rivals was cut to 6 points with 3 rounds of matches left in the campaign. Ajax can secure the title next Sunday if they beat ADO Den Haag at home and the early kickoff, and Feyenoord fails to win away at 5th place PSV Eindhoven later in the day. In France, tightrope walker Denis Jocelyn crossed the Seine River by balancing on a 150-meter-long cable. Cheered by hundreds of Parisians and tourists, the acrobat covered his eyes halfway through. He performed without harness or net, but several police boats were ready in case he fell. The tightrope walker said he overcomes his fear by focusing on positive thoughts. And finally, fair weather continues tonight with partly cloudy skies and northwesterly moderate winds. Tomorrow it continues to be warm in hilly areas and relatively hot in other parts of the kingdom. A drop in temperatures is expected in the evening as the hot air mass eases off after bringing a rise in temperatures above their seasonal average. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect relatively hot weather tomorrow with southerly moderate to brisk winds and slightly choppy seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. To end the news, here's a reminder of our top stories. His Majesty the King discusses with visiting Arab League Secretary General the need to boost joint Arab action and ways to serve Arab issues. Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel is willing to continue U.S.-brokered peace talks with the Palestinians, but not at any price. And vote counting is underway in Afghanistan 1 day after a landmark poll to elect a new president to succeed Hamid Karzai. With that, we come to the end of tonight's news. I'm Nancy Khair. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.